All right, well, let's call this Board Education and Business Committee meeting to order on Thursday, April 14th. And I just want to acknowledge that we are on the traditional and ancestral grounds of this Coast Salish people. And if I could please have a motion to adopt the agenda. Trustee De Groot, seconded by, I have no things. I'm going to say Trustee Spilsbury, and all those in favor. Great. And I believe the only item on our agenda is budget, so I will turn that over to our Secretary Treasurer. Oh, yes.
I just got a message from Rob. He's running late due to traffic, and he's hoping you'll start without him.
Perfect. Okay, we will. So over to you, Secretary Treasurer.
Thank you. There's two related items. The first will be the updated year-end projection. And the reason I'm bringing that to this committee is it impacts the potential surplus available for balancing the 2022-2023 budget. So as you're aware, we bring you updated estimates and they're dynamic and they change and new things are known and pressures change, and I want to share that with you where we're at today. It's improved since the last time you've seen a year-end estimate for what we're projecting from the current year's surplus. So I'm about to share my screen. I go back to the agenda, and it's on the second page. So the first item I would like to bring to your attention is previously I was showing that we'd be on budget on the provincial grant. The February count has come in beyond our budgeted expectations of $209,959. So that's new and that is updated in the projection. We continue to have stronger ISP International Student Program revenues than we had originally budgeted, resulting in an additional surplus of $356,000 generated from that account. There are cost pressures related to that. For example, commission for those students that appear later on. We also are looking a little bit better on our miscellaneous revenue, and most of that again relates to the International Student Program and fees for registration for the next year. They get recorded in this year, so it shows some of the strength of what we're expecting next year. Rentals is exceeding, mainly due to the Charles Hoey lease, and we're now able to start renting our facilities out a little bit more than we were previously. In September, we're now doing it much more frequently. And interest revenue, I think that number is probably going to end up being higher. We just did not reflect the 0.5% change 2 days ago. Was it either yesterday or the day? It was either yesterday or the day before that the Bank of Canada upped the base lending rate by 0.5%. That will reflect in our investment funds that we have on hand with the Ministry of Finance. So I actually think we'll generate more revenue and interest than what we're currently showing here. Those interest rates aren't reflected in the projection yet. Continuing to track very closely on principals, vice principals, and teacher salaries. So these are where we are underspending, very close on the size of those budgets. You can see here that we have funds that we're surplusing in two QP accounts, one for education assistance and the other for clerical and noon hour. And that doesn't mean we haven't hired the FTE or paid the people that we had it correctly in the FTE, but I believe we've over budgeted. And I'm going to show you a potential savings option as we move into the actual budget discussions. But the reason for that is we use a formula in our calculation. We use a formula-based system in our budgeting, and it calculates the number of weeks times the number of hours times the rate of pay to really come up with each individual's budget item. Getting the number of weeks right means using an estimate on who will use their vacation during the school year, which they're allowed to use 2 weeks, and who will use their vacation after the school year. In other words, to carry them into the summer with some additional income. If you use it after, you need to add those weeks to the number of weeks that we're paying somebody for the year. If they use it during, then that goes into the replacement budget. And I believe we have one too many weeks in our formula. So I'm going to come back to that. And if we take that, we won't see those surpluses in the future. Very close here on excluded salaries. This is predominantly related to a carpenter position that hasn't been filled yet. excluded going just over a bit here. And then casual replacements. So we've already upped the budget by about 150,000. I'm making an estimate here for the staff who will begin to use the new Employment Standards Act provision for 5 days of illness for a casual employee. So I'm making an assumption that because that is effective April 1st, that we'll begin to see that utilization. And I put about $100,000 into the projection for that usage for the balance of this school year. In-service extracurricular, again, showing that the budget is on track, fully spent, but clearly we've only spent about half of it. But much of that will be restricted and be required to be carried into the next year. So I'm just assuming that schools will spend what they've been given. Often field trips and things happen more in the spring than they do at other times of the year. So we'll begin to see the release time for that happen. Benefits were ahead overall on 15 million by about 447,000, predominantly related to the pension benefit account, which we're looking at our budget formulas to make sure that they're accurate. Coming down into the services and supplies area, seeing our supplies go over, maintenance supplies, fuel rates. Thankfully, diesel fuel starting to come down again a little bit. And utilities, again, it's been cool and cold, and it continues to be cold in the month of April, below average temperatures. So that shows that we would be underspending our expenditures budget by about 821,000, and I now have a revised surplus from the current year of 1.5 million. So if there's no questions on that, that 1.5 million is going to come into my next presentation, which is really the heart of this meeting, is to look at where's the budget at. We were together on March 29th, where we reviewed the opening budget position, and I'm going to walk through how that's changed and some of the options for balancing the budget for this year. So, but to do that, I need to share a PowerPoint, which is my next step here. And here we go. And you can't see that very well. Slideshow from beginning. And now you should see just a full screen of my opening slide. Thumbs up. Thank you. So always like to begin by a review of the 2022-2023 budget guiding principles to keep these up front of mind as we have our conversations around budget. And this was our opening statement, which really talks about allocating funding that aligns with a strategic plan. And in specifically, that's the first priority. Also develop the budget as a mechanism to aid in reconciliation, account for uncertainties of the global COVID-19 pandemic and the effects on the school district, be transparent, which must include public and partner input, and that process is well underway. And I'll review the timelines of meetings that are yet to come and the ones that have already been accomplished by the board as we go through this presentation. Developed on the principle of equity, meets all of our regulatory requirements, school act, collective agreements, board policy, thinks in a multi-year framework, balances short and long-term priorities, and maintains an appropriate contingency balance. So all those things we're going to try to keep in mind here as we go through the presentation. And also the 4 priorities for those, I think everybody's really familiar on the board, but if those in the audience, learning, Indigenous ways of knowing, culture, care, and future focused systems. So I said on March 29th that the story of this year's budget was inflation. This is a provincial story. You're going to hear a lot of boards as they talk about their budgets for the 2022-2023, the impact of inflation in a year where our funding rate has not been changed. So we have the same per pupil rate for next year as we do for this year, but yet many of our costs, specifically the ones we reviewed last time, such as employee benefits and CPP, and fuel and maintenance supplies and custodial supplies, and all those items are under financial inflationary pressure. So far, the board has established the 2021-2022 budget guiding principles. considered priorities of the strategic plan when discussing options. You've issued a survey on the budget that will close on the 17th of April. There was a rights holders liaison meeting. There were 6 additional liaison meetings last Friday with DSAC, the students, CVTF, the USW, CUPE, the principals, and District Parent Advisory Council. And we presented information at the March regular board Education and Business Committee meeting, and again at the regular board meeting. And at the March 29th meeting, that's where you reviewed the funding announcement and the contents of the opening budget position. And at this meeting, we're going to start to talk about options, and we'll invite feedback, and we'll spend some time looking at the 2 primary special purpose funds. So new, on March 31st, royal assent was received for the following 2 amendments to the Employment Standards Act. The first one isn't really material to the budget. It just means that annual entitlements for sick leave are now based on a calendar year rather than the employment year. However, the second one means that 5 days of annual paid illness and injury leave are now available to all employees who do not already receive that within their collective agreement. So that would be our casual groups. So that would mean our CUPE casuals, USW casuals, and teacher casuals are now entitled to 5 days per calendar year of sick leave usage. And that wasn't previously in our budget, and it's not being funded for. We're estimating $400,000. That is a pretty, for our size of school district, that seems pretty consistent with what I'm hearing from some of our neighbors. And as I read the trustee or the news related to school districts through the BC School Trustees Association, I'm paying close attention to what others are saying their number is going to be. And I believe $400,000 is a pretty accurate, close estimate of what that was going to cost in next year's budget. So we hadn't accounted for that. We didn't know in the first draft. Subsequently, also, there's been an addition of an early years manager per the board's motion on April 5th, 2022. So we started with a $2.4 million identified shortfall, and that was before adding in any surplus. And now that's altered. I'm now going to start with the $2.9 million shortfall because we've had the Employment Standards Act, casual sick leave numbers, and we've had the addition of the early years manager. This is a summary, and I'll send this out to all trustees. This is a summary of what's currently in the budget, how many FTE by employee group, and what those costs are related to that. It's transparent information. The one employee group that's really changed here was teachers, because we needed to make a small adjustment for increased enrollment. And this is where we spend the rest of it on employee benefits and services and supplies. And this is what it looks like moving into the next year. So we're currently balancing off a $94,540,580 expenditure budget. And unfortunately, our revenues don't match that right now. And that's where we get into the options here. And so I'm going to walk through some things that we think can help with balancing the budget. Number one, the board can consider appropriating surplus, and I'll have a surplus slide a little bit further along here. I've used $2 million because that leaves almost exactly 3% left in projected surplus. The board can choose to use more or less. I'm just suggesting that as a starter number because you have a surplus contingency policy to maintain between 1% and 3%, and it allows for some long-term planning of surplus utilization. Interest revenue, based on the changes to interest rates and the fact that we believe we are going to have more in the budget that we've carried over this year, we believe we can make an adjustment to our interest revenue, which helps offset the shortfall. So we've just taken $2.9 million down to $834,000. Seemed pretty easy. And now we move on to some of the expenditure reduction options. Number one, occasionally we overpay a premium, and we did so with the USW only when we get something called a benefit premium holiday, we have the option of not paying a premium for a month or two based on money that's accumulated within the benefit pool. So we have one of those for the USW. It's something we can apply to the budget, and it's something we can apply to our expenditures for next year. It doesn't reduce anybody's benefits. It just means that the board overpaid in the current year. It's a small amount. I talked about how we've been surplusing funds within the EA Education Assistant and clerical account, and I believe it's tied to us budgeting for one too many weeks. I'm suggesting that's an easy adjustment to make, but it will eliminate that surplus generation moving forward, but it gets our budget closer to actual. So I think that's one that we can do, and it has a cost savings of $289,000. The next one relates to making an adjustment to our average teacher salaries. When we budget, we take everybody we have today, and we assume they're all going to stay with us. And those that are moving up the pay bands will move up their pay bands. But the reality is people retire or they leave during the school year. And we often make an adjustment to our average teacher salary, and it's a pretty safe one to make, to account for people who may be more senior in the payroll structure, retiring or leaving or going on leave and being replaced with a more junior employee who will cost the board less money. So that's $439,000 of potential expenditure reductions. And I go to another slide here, which means a net of now needing to find $395,000. You can see if we didn't have that new casual language, we'd be really close to balanced right here. But there's also things that are considerations that the board may want to add. There's some asks from some departments, and I'm going to list those out here, and they start to add up. One, the board could consider holding a COVID contingency. So we don't know what September is going to look like, but should the board be keeping some funding aside in the event that they need to have a quick response to something in the fall? Principal exempt compensation percentage adjustment. As the unionized employees go through their bargaining, there will be likely a compensation adjustment or a compensation package for the 2022-2023 year and the next 2 years after. What the board are permitted to provide to the principal, vice principals, and exempt is usually tied to whatever the teachers get. We don't know what that is yet, but this is making a budget assumption of a percentage. And I don't want to say the percentage because it assumes that I know what's being offered to the other groups, and I don't. But I just have some money set aside for that. That is the group that is not funded. Principals are not funded, exempt are not funded, but CUPE, USW, and teachers are funded provincially. Always a challenge. There is a discussion around a literacy teacher program. Currently, it exists at both Coheman and Alexander under some special grant funding. I know it's a priority for district leadership team to continue that program in some capacity. So I've listed that. $106,000 being our average teacher salary, including benefits. There is a technology dashboard, which allows with data extraction and data management that has been noted. And you see these as a negative because they're adding to the shortfall. We can no longer install technology out of the annual facilities grant plan fund, which means, for example, hanging a TV in a classroom. There's a request for a website update. It's approximately $30,000, but it continues on over a number of years at a similar rate as it gets developed. There's a small request for transportation routing adjustment, just based on where some students live in the next year that are known. And a request to, in the current year's budget, the transportation lead hand position was reduced in favor of creation of a mechanic. So there's been a request to restore that. I don't have a dollar figure here, but it showed up early on. There was it was being investigated that we were looking at an automated dispatch system to assist with recruitment and getting people called out on an earlier basis. And then there's a small adjustment required that came in after the original projection around industry training authority student payments. And I believe that one can just be offset by revenue, but I've shown it here for the purposes of this exercise. So if we did all that, we're short by 946,000. So we need a plan. And that's where I move into the next slides. So this is the surplus. At the end of this year, we're currently projecting another 1.5 million, which I've just shown you. You see that here on my slide. We have currently an unrestricted surplus of 3.3, which means that we're projecting 4.8 at the end of the year. So that's very healthy. It's unusual. It's a result of abnormal spending patterns during a pandemic. I don't project that pattern will continue. It's also a result of a lot of influx of additional funding that came in from both the federal and provincial government over the last 2 years. That's 5.1% of budget. That is well beyond your contingency policy. This is why I suggested 2 million was probably a pretty comfortable amount, but it could be potentially more. So if you did that, if you drew $2 million, that would be this blue bar here, and this is the amount that's been used to balance each year along the way. That would leave you with still this large orange bar, which represents what's left in unrestricted for use in future years. And I want to, before I present some options, talk a bit about budgeting risk, or the way I view budgeting risk. There's always a certain amount of risk in developing estimates. And I'll use an example. We use our prior year's experience, known rates, and predicted trends to try to reduce that risk. But an example would be when we establish a hydro budget, we can make a calculated budget based on how much we spent last year, what we know the percentage is going to be increasing in a rate, but we can't predict how cold the winter is going to be. And sometimes we fall short, and sometimes we have surplus funds left over. So there's always a risk when we make these calculations that they're not going to be perfect, but we do the best we can with the information that we have. But I also like to talk about not only financial risk, but I use a term called learning risk. If we're overly conservative in our budget while ensuring a surplus, we may remove important services and opportunities for learning. And so it's that balance. And when I talk about the next options, I just wanted to frame it that way. There's always a balance in balancing the risk. If we were to develop a perfectly conservative budget, we'd ensure a surplus, but we might not be delivering everything we could be during that year. So we always have to keep that in mind and balance those perspectives. So here's what I think are some options. We're currently in this recommended budget proposing accessing about $2 million of surplus, which would leave just about 2.8 million remaining for future years. If you use 2 million, that's 3% of budget, but you could explore accessing more surplus to help balance this budget and still stay well within your 1 to 3% contingency policy. And I suspect the final version of this budget will likely do that to some degree. The International Student Program has already exceeded in the current year the proposed budget for next year. Perhaps we could consider pushing that out, those dollar figures out again, up a little bit more as the world begins to open for students learning abroad. We may be able to put a little bit of additional revenue into that budget. That helps offset the shortfall. And the Bank of Canada increased the central bank lending rate from 0.25% by 0.25% on March 2nd and a further 0.5 on April 13th. And it's anticipated that there'll be further increases. This almost doubles our interest rate that we currently get in our bank because interest rates are were so low prior to these movements. I believe there's additional interest revenue that we could consider putting into the budget beyond the initial proposal. Other areas, the current proposal includes a reduction to the average teacher salary of $100,000. This is based on the assumption that teachers will retire or go on leave and be replaced by teachers at a lower cost. We have so many teachers this year, more than I've ever heard at this time, who have already declared their retirement intentions this year. One school, 7. which is more than we've had in, entirely in entirety in some years in the recent years, especially during the two predominantly pandemic years. So I think, we could consider moving that number, because we are certainly going to have more younger teachers following all those retirements, which is going to reduce our salary costs. I think some of those items that are on those wish lists that I just presented could be accomplished by redistributing resources that already exist within a department as part of the balancing of priorities. If you want something, sometimes you have to give something up to get something. Usually you have to give something up to get something. An example of that would be to achieve a literacy teacher. Maybe there'll be a proposal that will take a different type of teacher and take that FTE and repurpose it. I presented a COVID contingency as an option. As this is an unknown item, I think that would be an appropriate item for surplus to be used on. It would be thought of as a one-time item, and it's unknown, so that's what surplus is for. It's the board's policy talks about holding it for unknown situations, and we don't know yet what that will look like in the fall. And then as I look at wage increases, it's nice to put some funding in the budget for the non-unionized staff, but we have no idea what that would be or when we'll even know. Wage increases for CUPE, USW, and teachers are still at the provincial level in the bargaining cycle. The board could hold off on making any decisions around budgeting once the final surplus is known at the end of this school year, and readdress those wages in the fall, which would be retroactive to likely to July 1st, but look at the whole issue again in the fall once we have all the new student numbers and everything in. The money that would be being held could be conservative or maybe insufficient. We just don't know. So those are some options that we've been thinking about that I think together can help to balance this budget without significant alterations to programming or employee levels. Looking now at the two special purpose funds, because I said we would do a quick review of those. The first one I want to look at is the Classroom Enhancement Fund. And it's made up of three components. The first is to actually pay for the number of teachers that we need to hire to be compliant with the class size and composition language. And it's about 84 FTE. And you see a preliminary allocation of 8.9 million there. And that is the same as this year. And that will alter based on the number of teachers that we actually have to hire under this program in the fall. But more specifically, there's overhead. And that overhead, we're just recommending the exact same budget. And staff would be recommending the exact same budget for the overhead expenditures as we had this year. And I'll show those here next. This is the same amount of funding. Currently, we support, oops, I got to move, sorry, just one moment. I have to move my view over here. Currently, we support a position in our human resources department, and we haven't built in any increase here because we don't know what that might be. That's still completely up in the air. We've rolled over the same level of education assistance. I guess I changed the FTE a little bit because I think it should have been 6 here, but it was 5.9 for the amount of money that we had. Leave replacements, that's our sick leave for those 84 teachers. We have in-service that's tied to funding that has to be set aside per our collective agreement for in-service and inclusive education for any teacher who has a designated student in the classroom. And then Pro-D funds for teachers because it ties to the number of teachers that we have. So that balances the fund off almost exactly the same as it was in the prior year. And that was based on a submission a couple of years ago to the Ministry of Education on what the board required for the non-teacher component of the restoration language. And then as we move into thinking about the Community Link Fund, it's been announced at 682,000. The board in 2020, 2021, so we're going back a couple of budget years, passed a budget that showed a phased reduction of funding for the community school component with the refocusing of those funds into the school food program. And the budget for 2022, 2023 continues with these recommendations. And so you would see here that the funding remains the same between the current year and next year. The staffing all remains the same, but as we transition away from the community school association fees, there's a zero now, and those funds have been put down in the food program as per the previous budget's intention. And so that becomes a balanced community link budget. Other special purpose funds that the board has is the Learning Improvement Fund. We'll be budgeting $300,101. That adds an hour per day currently to our education, sorry, an hour per week currently to our education assistants for collaboration time. And that is a co-managed fund between CUPE and the board, and it gets signed off on at the end of each year. And the annual facilities grant is up slightly from just over 1.8 million to 1.9 million for the next year. And that supports all the capital upgrades in the buildings. So this is where we're at so far. The budget survey has been released. And I know within a few days, we were up to 77 responses. I'm sure it's more, and I'll get that total when we get the summary at the next BEBC meeting. The results of that survey will be presented on April 26th. The advisory committee agenda just went out, and it's for next Tuesday, and it will have the ability for the advisory committee to provide feedback on the budget proposals that this committee has just seen. Following the advisory, we'll get a public meeting to also look at budget proposals. And then all the feedback, all of the meetings, all of the feedback will all be presented and reviewed around with options for balancing the budget. Certainly looking at some of those risk areas to help with budgeting, with balancing that I've just shown you. That'll happen on the 26th. From that, we're hoping to get instructions from the committee to bring back a balanced budget. We'll do that on the 28th at a special BEBC meeting. And then we hope at that meeting that the BEBC committee will move that budget forward to the board for adoption on May the 3rd, and then staffing starts on May the 4th. And I know I went through that without an opportunity to stop and take questions or comments, but I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I can go back to any of my slides if there's anything we want to revisit.
Thank you. That was really comprehensive, Jason. That was great. Welcome, Trustee Hutchins. Would you like to take over chairing this meeting, please?
No, you're doing a wonderful job.
Okay, I will continue on. Are there any comments? Trustee Hutchins.
Apologize for being late. Jason, on one of the slides earlier, you were listed possible additions to the budget, and one of them was the automated dispatch system, but I didn't hear why there was no price attached to that.
We haven't fully calculated it yet, and there may be offsets to that. An automated dispatch system typically doesn't require as many individuals, so there may be a net savings there that would result in that being close to cost neutral.
So when do we have that information to decide whether we're going to proceed with it or not?
I believe that those estimates are being collected now. I know that certainly we're looking at what software integrates with our system. I'm hoping we'll have it by the conclusion of this budget process. But if it is in fact a cost neutral item, the implementation of that could occur even in the fall.
Trustee Thorne.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. That was pretty intense. I know you prepared this for some things that would show up in the budget, but I didn't think we were going to take such a serious spanking. And I kind of disappointed with Cupid, UW. It seems like a lot of our money is going to them and less to the schools. And that has me concerned. I don't know if that's making any sense, but looking at what's going to come in 2023, I'm really apprehensive to say it's going to be a relaxed year because I don't think it is. But anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Trustee Croft.
I have two questions. And the first one is there was a list early on of some options to spend some money on,
Mhm.
and that was based on feedback. Did you have anything in there about well-being and wellness? I just don't recall.
Not costed at this time.
Okay.
You know, I think we're starting to identify that as a trend in the feedback, and I'm hoping that when we come back to you at the next meeting, that will have been fleshed out a little bit more.
Okay.
It's certainly coming up, and I understand that it's coming up quite a bit in the budget survey as well, the public survey. And we're yet to conclude all the public feedback. We do have our advisory committee meeting, we do have our public meeting, we do have the survey results. So we hadn't quite pulled that together yet.
Okay, thank you. I'm just glad to know it's on the radar. Thank you for that. And then my other question is, I can see that a lot of our predicted expenses are very stable. Are we exposed in any way, though, to inflation? Are there some, like we have contracts and so forth already in place? So, but where are we in terms of some things have got to go up between now and next June?
Yeah, and we've tried to factor a lot of those in already, like fuel prices, maintenance supplies. We've already factored that into the opening position. Utilities, those rates have already been adjusted, or absenteeism. What we don't have anywhere in the budget, because the collective agreements aren't settled, is those increases.
Thank you.
Trustee Spilsbury.
Thanks, Jason. Really comprehensive overview. I'm just trying to remember the options. And these are options to add into the budget that you listed. And I'm just wondering, are some of the budgets then already in place unable to be flexible around some of these areas? For example, the tech dashboard and installation. I know that's a fairly good budget. Are we not able to flex within that budget?
Yeah, and I think when I was mentioning about repurposing of funding, there may be some areas where we can do that. This is still very, very early. I think those are the things what we need to look at. And what I'm hoping to do next is to get to trustees backup sheets on options and plans for how they can be accomplished, which we've done in previous years. It's more difficult to do that in this meeting format, but I'd like to get it emailed out to trustees with backgrounders on all of those.
That would be really helpful. If you could include where we are now, like when you say COVID contingency, does that mean that we have eliminated some areas of the contingency?
Yeah. Well, yes, we have. We had one-time items for custodial and I guess it would be supplies. We had about $200,000 in this current year's budget that was put in place for this current year. I've taken that out in the opening position, and now we need to talk about what goes back in, and that's why I've listed it at a lesser amount based on some of the feedback that's been received to date. But there's a lot more information I need to get to trustees on all of that. I'm just using this meeting as an introductory platform. And then we will prepare a package with a backgrounder on every line item for you to look at how that could be managed within an existing budget, or what could be potentially added for a solution to reduce, to come up with a shortfall.
And I one more. No, sorry.
Yeah.
I'd just like to piggyback on Trustee Hutchins' comment about the automated dispatch system. We've been interested in that for a fair amount of time. So we not only need, what would that cost us, but I think for me, is there a phase in kind of ability so that we can put it over a, 3 to 5 year plan or something that would allow us to move forward?
I don't think the dollar amount's going to require that.
Huh.
It's not as much as it is significant, but it's not. I don't believe it carries itself over multi-years to be able to afford it.
Ah, okay, that's good news. Thank you.
I'll just comment before, Trustee Croft, how many, would that eliminate positions, or would there be positions still in place to have to use the automated system?
I think that still has to be fully determined. Typically there has to be somebody. There's always a human component that a computer cannot solve. But that balance, there may be some balancing there.
Thank you. Trustee Croft.
Thank you. I just remembered what I meant to ask. So it's been a while, but at one point we had decided to try and do a bit of a program looking ahead to replace equipment and so forth, generally around operations, custodial and stuff. And I know that we have been doing that. Is that ongoing? Are we still looking to do some improvements every year?
Yeah, as we come, so I'll speak to vehicles. I'll start with vehicles. So as we speak to vehicles, we have had single-use vehicles for the last 2 years, and as crew and members are now starting to come back and be able to go out together, that allows us to retire some vehicles out of the fleet that maybe should have been retired out of the fleet without a necessary need for replacement in the next year. As far as sort of tools and such for operations, we've already made a reasonable inflationary adjustment to that supply budget, which can help to accommodate that, as we also have done to the custodial budget, which can help to accommodate that, because they can buy from within their internal budgets with managing what they have. So we have consulted with those managers, and I think we're okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Trustee Spilsbury.
Can I also ask about information that you're going to provide us on each of these options? Could we also be provided kind of evidence of success of the program if we're wanting to continue it? For example, I see the literacy teacher for the 2 schools. I mean, we know it's in place. We have this assumption that it's great, but do we really know that it's making a difference?
Okay.
And I don't mean that in a negative way. I'm just saying, let's be sure that we're putting our money where we really are sure it's needed. Thank you.
Jason.
Yeah, that's when I'll need some help from the senior education team on, and I'm sure that they'll do that along with me, help me prepare those backgrounders, especially around those educational program items.
Thank you. Any more questions from trustees? Okay, well, I think we await quite anxiously the next follow-ups and the more information. It's a very busy time. It's a busy time for you, a busy time for us. Yes, Jason.
So I'll aim to have details out very early next week. I do appreciate that we do have a DEBC meeting on April 26th, and if trustees want review time or together review time, we'll need to allow that to happen between now and then. So I do know the timelines that I need to get those backgrounders out sooner than later.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think, again, I don't have my agenda in front of me. Is that our full agenda?
It's the full agenda.
That is the full agenda. Any more comments before we adjourn? Do I have a motion to adjourn the meeting? Trustee DeGroot, my Trustee Croft, and all those in favor. Thanks again, Jason. That was good. Very full.
Yes, thanks everybody. I appreciated all the conversation and the content. That was great. Thank you.